The moon rode like a silver boat over quiet rooftops, while a harsh decree rattled doors and hearts. A mother pressed her ear to the hush of night, hearing only the soft breath of the child she cradled close. Outside, sandals scraped stone and torches hissed in the breeze, but inside, courage took shape in steady hands. She gathered reeds and hope, weaving them together into something small enough to hide yet strong enough to carry a promise. A sister watched, wide-eyed, guarding the doorway with more bravery than her years could count. The river murmured beyond the fields, winding past palace walls and whispering that danger slept with one eye open. When fear knocked, faith answered, and the tiny room filled with a quiet plan. If the world would not make room for this life, then the river of God would. The basket waited, a cradle of secrets, and the night leaned in to listen. Dawn unrolled like a golden ribbon, and the river answered with 1,000 tiny mirrors. The little craft rocked in the breathing water, while a brave watcher moved along the bank, matching its slow drift step for step. In nearby fields, workers woke, and the world began its ordinary chores. Not knowing a miracle floated past, reed stalks whispered secrets to the breeze, and birds stitched patterns across the sky. The sound of laughter carried from gardens upriver, voices that did not know fear as the humble quarter knew it. Yet even there, the same sun warmed faces, and the same river tied lives together. A court of power stirred. A home of courage waited, and between them the child dreamed, held by a cradle of reeds and by a purpose older than kings. Closer to the gardens, the river slowed, as if it too wished to see what would happen next. The watcher kept to the reeds, heart beating in time with the lap of water against woven sides. She rehearsed words in silence, bold words for a child to carry. Should anyone lift the lid and find a story that cried? In her mind she saw her mother's hands, still stained with pitch, and her father's nod of faith that felt heavier than stone, yet lighter than air. She thought of the decree that stalked alleys at night, and of the one who measured waters in his own palm. When laughter drifted nearer, and fine sandals scuffed the riverbank, she steadied herself. If the river delivered the child to kindness, she would step forward, like a door opening. The river offered up its secret with the faintest cry, a sound like a sparrow calling for morning. The princess stopped mid-step, kindness quickening her breath, and the servants followed her gaze to the small ark among lilies. One gesture sent them wading forward, another beckoned the little vessel to shore. The lid loosened with a soft sigh of reeds, and tiny hands unfurled like petals, reaching for a world that had waited for him. The princess's eyes filled, not with fear of decrees, but with compassion stronger than a seal in wax. Even the breeze hushed, as if holy ground could be water too. The watcher in the reeds read the moment like a doorway swinging wide, and courage nudged her feet toward daylight. Words arrived as if they had been carried downstream all along. The watcher stepped forward and spoke with calm beyond her sighs, offering help that sounded simple as bread and brilliant as sunrise. Would the princess like someone to care for the little one until he was strong? The suggestion fit the moment like a key turns in a lock. Smiles answered sorrow. Orders softened into kindness. The river, which had seemed to hide a child, now introduced him to protectors he would not have found in any alley or whispering night. Somewhere behind them, a mother felt a thread tug in her heart and knew she should be ready. The basket had done its work. Now people would carry the promise the rest of the way. Kindness opened its mouth and spoke in the language of decisions. The princess, moved by the little cry that had pierced her guard of gold and decree, gathered the river's gift against her heart and looked toward the reeds where the watcher stood. Words passed between them like doves. Could a nurse be found from among the Hebrews to care for this child? The plan landed softly, yet it thundered through the morning with promise. A path suddenly appeared where there had been only water and fear. Servants shifted from formality to helpful bustle. Courtiers beyond the garden steps would one day argue, but not today. The basket that had once hidden became a bridge, and the girl who had once watched became a messenger with wings on her feet. Somewhere, a mother felt hope rush back like breath after tears, and the river carried not just a child, but a future that refused to drown. The watcher ran, not wild with panic, but steady with purpose, as if her feet already knew the route destiny had chalked in dust. Houses leaned in, listening. Neighbors looked up from bread dough and buckets, sensing that a thread had been tugged and a tapestry was about to shift. She burst through the door where lamplight and pitch scent had kept vigil through the night. The words tumbled out: invitation, honor, a wage from the very house that had thundered against them. Hope rose like a song that even walls could hum. A father's shoulders loosened. A mother's hands trembled with joy that felt almost too large to fit inside her chest. They did not wait. Cloaks were gathered, a small pouch taken, a prayer whispered that sounded like thank you, thank you. Then feet returned to the river, following the trail the basket had drawn upon the water, toward a meeting written before mornings were invented. At the river steps, the world seemed to hold its breath again, but this time it inhaled welcome. The princess met the mother with a gaze that honored what courage had already done in secret places. She spoke simply. "Take this child, nurse him for me, and I will pay you." The words landed like shelter. Law could scowl for now, but love had secured a contract with kindness stamped by a royal seal. No fear could unwrite. Arms that had released now received. Tears that had hardened into salt became sweet again. Servants noted details, counted days, arranged escorts for the road between palace gardens and humble lanes. The mother kissed the child's brow, not in farewell but in beginning. Across the water, reeds applauded. Above them, a heron traced a slow white signature across the sky. The river had returned its treasure with wages, dignity, and time. Days grew into seasons, each one braided with milk, lullabies, and whispered truths about the God who saw slaves and called them his own. Laughter learned the paths between the loom and the doorway. Tiny feet tapped rhythms on packed earth. Small hands reached for stories bigger than pyramids. The child grew in safety's circle while danger prowled in distant halls, and the mother sowed courage into ordinary moments. A prayer over bread, a psalm hummed during chores, a blessing threaded through a mended tunic. The sister became a storyteller, the father a shield. When the child asked why the stars seemed to sing, they answered, "Because the one who made them watches over you." And yet, they kept a quiet readiness, knowing a promise made by a princess would summon them back to the river's path when the time came to hand this growing light to palace walls. The day arrived as all turning days do. Quietly at first, then bright as a trumpet without needing to be loud. Cloaks were folded, a small bundle prepared, blessings brushed like kisses across a brow that had once been hidden among reeds. The path to the gardens felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because courage had learned the way. The princess received them with the same compassion that had first defied fear. She named the child for the water that once carried him, for being drawn out and destined to draw others out one day. The mother's arms released again, not into danger but into purpose, trusting that the God who wrote beginnings also keeps middles and endings. And the river, faithful witness, flowed on, past fields and palaces, past tears and songs, bearing a story now too strong for any decree to hold under. Stone columns rose like sunlit trees while water sang in hidden channels, and a boy who once floated in reeds now walked marble corridors. Perfume of lotus and ground myrrh drifted through cool halls where scholars traced stars onto wax tablets and taught the language of power with careful tongues. He learned the stories carved on walls, battles, barges, and gods with falcon eyes, and how to carry himself like one born to command. Yet, the river's lullaby still echoed in him, a softer wisdom braided into memory by lullabies and blessings from a home of clay and courage. Servants bowed. Courtiers watched. The princess smiled with fierce warmth, as if shielding him with light. Between lessons in law and measure, the boy listened for a voice deeper than drums. A voice that seemed to rise from water and wind, telling him he belonged to something larger than any palace could hold. Years stacked like bricks, and strength found its shape. He learned to read currents and command oars, to count grain and measure stone, to speak so soldiers moved and scribes recorded. Yet another current tugged beneath the surface. Memories of songs about a god who bends down to listen, stories of ancestors who walked by promises instead of chariots. In quiet courtyards, he traced those words on his heart where no stylus could erase them. The princess watched with eyes that carried yesterday's act of courage into every tomorrow, and she reminded him that compassion is also a royal art. When he stood at balcony rails, the river looked back like a mirror that refused to flatter, showing both splendor and need. He began to wonder whether power was a cloak to keep for himself, or a mantle to lift burdens no crown could see. A day of inspection led beyond gardens into heat that tasted of dust and effort. Hammers kept time against stone. Ropes creaked. Orders clipped the air. He walked among laborers whose backs wrote a hard story, and something inside him answered as if a string long hidden had been plucked. Faces lifted when he passed, curious, guarded, and oddly familiar to his heart. He noticed calluses where rings would never rest, bruises that no painter would gild. A foreman's bark snapped across the sunlight, and the boy, now nearly a man, felt anger bloom like sudden flame. Not the kind that burns to boast, but the kind that aches to set wrong things right. He asked questions in a calm voice, and heard answers weighed down by fear. That night, the rhythm of hammers would not leave his ears. It beat like a drum calling him to remember who he truly was. Night draped the palace in cool indigo, and fountains whispered secrets to anyone willing to listen. Sleep would not come. He walked colonnades where moonlight turned stone to milk, and sat beside a pool that remembered the river. Questions rose like birds startled from reeds. Why had he been pulled from waters others still drowned beneath? What did compassion demand from a life cradled by both clay and gold? He thought of a mother's songs and a princess's daring mercy, of a name that meant being drawn out. Perhaps names were assignments, not ornaments. He spoke softly to the one who hears, words too honest for court. Teach me how to carry what you've placed in my hands. The wind replied without words, stirring palm fronds in a rhythm that felt like yes, but also like wait. He stood with new resolve, knowing waiting could be a kind of obedience. Morning returned with a glare sharp as a blade, and the worksite's clamor rose before the sun found its height. He came again, not as a spectator to marvel at order, but as a witness searching for truth. Then the moment arrived like a shout breaking a fragile jar. A worker stumbled under a load, and a taskmaster's fury fell swift and cruel. Time seemed to slow until each breath was a choice. The ache that had throbbed in him for years surged forward, not reckless but fierce and focused, demanding he decide who he would be. Around him, eyes darted, some pleading, some afraid. Dust rose. Heat pressed. The world narrowed to injustice and the heartbeat that refused to ignore it. The scene held its breath at the edge of a cliff the story would soon cross, promising that courage, once awakened, will not return to sleep. The shout cracked the noon like dry clay, a taskmaster's anger falling where mercy should have stood. Dust spun up from trampled straw as a man staggered and covered his head, and the crowd drew back into silence, edged with fear. He had come again to watch, to learn, to listen, but the sight burned, and something long simmering rose like a storm breaking open. He looked this way and that. There were only kilns and sky, only hammers and hearts beating too fast. In a breath that felt as heavy as stone, He stepped between cruelty and the one who could no longer stand beneath it. The struggle was brief, the outcome terrible, and the ground swallowed the secret with a hush of sand. No trumpet marked the moment, only the thud of regret and the fierce ache of justice misfired. The sun kept shining, but its light felt harder now, and the wind carried questions he could not yet answer. Morning returned with brittle brightness, and he sought the worksite again, hoping to mend the world by mending a quarrel. Two men argued, brothers by burden if not by mood, and he raised his hands for peace, asking why harm should come from those already harmed. But the answer pierced him. Who made you ruler and judge? Will you do to us what you did yesterday? The words clanged like dropped bronze. Secret sand felt suddenly thin. Whispers, like ants, ran everywhere. Fear moved in behind his ribs, cold and purposeful, naming what the sun would soon announce. He stepped back as if the ground had tilted, realizing that his act, meant to shield, had opened a door for wrath to find his name. The river once carried him from danger. Now danger flowed toward him like a flood. Somewhere beyond the walls, a throne was waking to the scent of rumor, and the hunt was already lacing its sandals. News travels on feet faster than chariots when fear runs ahead of it. The throne heard, and a storm gathered behind carved pillars. Orders snapped like reeds in a dry wind. Names were written. Seals pressed, sandals laced tight. The princess who once drew life from water felt her heart pulled two ways at once. Love facing law like a swallow before a hawk. He understood without a messenger. The city itself seemed to lean toward him with listening walls and watching eyes. He wrapped a cloak around his shoulders, around his past, and slipped into alleys that knew his footsteps. At the gate, the sky flared with late sun as if the day itself urged him to move. Behind, the river murmured farewell. Ahead, the desert waited with a silence large enough to hide a hunted man and loud enough to teach a listening one. He went because staying would end the story too soon. The desert opened like a book with few words and wide margins. Heat pressed down at noon. Stars cooled the world at night, until breath smoked in the dark. He walked until thoughts were thin, and prayers grew simple. Help me, guide me, hide me. Jackals called from far ridges. Sparse acacias cast brief islands of shade. Yet provision found him in small mercies. A trickle of water tucked beneath stone, a palm whose fruit blushed with sweetness, a wind that pushed him toward the east when his strength failed. With every step, noise fell away until only the pulse of life remained, steady as a drumbeat under sand. He remembered a woven basket cradled by reeds and understood that rescue can wear many shapes. Sometimes a princess's arms, sometimes a wilderness that swallows tracks. The anger of a king could not command the stars, and the stars watched over him like lamps in a kindly window. At last, a green hem stitched itself to the edge of the wilderness. A well, palm circled and busy with voices. He sat at a distance, gathering breath and caution, when rough laughter split the calm. Shepherds shouldered past a line of young women drawing water, knocking jars and confidence askew. Weariness might have argued for silence, but the old ache for justice woke again, gentler now, tempered by miles and mercy. He rose, not with a shout, but with steady hands and a servant's strength, pulling buckets, filling troughs, standing like a door where meanness tried to push through. Gratitude brightened tired faces. Names were spoken: Midian, Reuel, Zipporah. And the word stranger grew thin around him. As evening laid copper on the palms, he realized that the desert had not simply hidden him. It had delivered him to a place where kindness could take root and grow. Evening gathered like a shawl around the palms, and the well's music softened into the clink of jars stored for tomorrow. The stranger who had stood between rudeness and kindness found himself invited beneath a woven tent where lamps glowed like small suns. Bread hissed on a hot stone. Milk foamed in a wooden cup. dates shone like amber beads. Questions came gently: who he was, where he was going, why his eyes carried both palace polish and wilderness dust. He answered with careful threads, not boasting of strength, not hiding his sorrow. The elder's gaze measured him without weighing him down, and the daughter's smiles folded awkwardness into welcome. When laughter finally rose, it sounded like water after thirst. No decree hunted here. Only the ordinary laws of hospitality that turned strangers into guests and guests into friends. Night deepened, and with it, a quiet certainty. Perhaps this was not the end of a road, but the beginning of a path. Days made room for him the way dunes reshape around a new path. He worked beside the family with quiet strength, mending a gate hinge, lifting a trough, learning the routes where wells keep their secrets. In the cool of evenings, the elder asked for the rest of the story, and the young man unfolded it like a map with tear stains. A river cradle, a palace roof, the sting of injustice, a choice that ran ahead of wisdom, and feet that ran ahead of wisdom. Learn to flee? Silence honored sorrow before words stitched hope across it. Stay, the elder said, not as command, but as blessing. There is work that shapes a man kinder than crowns. The daughters echoed the welcome with baskets and shared jokes, turning awkward pauses into smiles. The desert had once been his hiding place. Now it became his teacher, and in its spacious classroom he began to learn the gait of patience. Seasons braided themselves. Lambing days, shearing songs, the quiet thunder of hooves returning at dusk, and affection ripened like figs under patient sun. The elder watched the way respect grew between the stranger and his daughter, a steady vine twining around shared work, shared prayers, shared laughter that forgot to end. When the time was ripe, words were brief and joyful. A simple feast gathered neighbors. Tambourines stitched rhythm to the dark. Blessings moved like warm light from hand to hand. The union was not a palace parade, but it shone brighter. Two lives fitted like joined timbers, stronger together against wind. He wore no signet ring, only a promise. She wore no diadem, only joy that needed no gold to be royal. Above the tent, stars approved with ancient patience, and the desert, their witness, held its breath long enough to remember that love can make even wilderness home. Time stepped softly, and a child's cry stitched new music into their days. He named the boy for the ache, and the comfort intertwined in his story. I am a stranger there, yet no longer alone. Nights found him pacing with the infant, whispering promises he barely understood yet fully believed. That the one who sees also plans paths through impossible places. Mornings found him among hills, learning the patient grammar of sheep, how wounded ones walk, how brave ones lead, how stillness can guide a flock more surely than shouting. In that quiet school, he learned to carry strength like water, shaped by what holds it. He thought less about palaces and more about faithfulness measured in small obediences, mended fences, steady watches, a prayer for rain, a song for sleep. The desert that once felt empty now brimmed with lessons, each step a word in a sentence God was writing across his life. Years rounded their edges, and the shepherd's steps traced wide circles through lonely country, past thorn and thyme, basalt and breeze. He learned the names of hidden springs and the moods of weather that speaks without words. At night he lay beneath a quilt of stars and remembered another people under a different sky, their groans threading his dreams like a low drum. Rumor carried on caravans that the old king had died and a new one wore the serpent crown, but Chains felt the same on any day. He did not know that the listening he practiced among sheep was preparing his ears for a call older than mountains. He only knew to keep watch, to lead gently, to lift the weak and slow the strong, and to pray in the pauses. Far off, a mountain kept its counsel, and a thorn thicket waited for the day it would burn, without burning, and speak a name that would steady the world. Years piled up like dunes, soft at the edges, fierce in the middle, and a weathered shepherd led woolly hearts across a shoulder of stone where wind spoke in dry syllables. Hoofprints crumbled behind him, but a pull, quiet as a memory, firm as a hand, drew him toward a lonely ridge. There, thorn branches caught flame as if sunrise had landed and forgotten to move on. The blaze hissed without smoke, roared without devouring, a contradiction steady as a heartbeat. He stepped closer and stopped, for the ground itself felt awake, aware, almost breathing. Sand cooled beneath his feet as he untied his sandals, not from custom but because awe unlocked the knots. A voice, more present than thunder yet gentler than rain, filled the space between stones. The past had been heard, the suffering seen, and a rescue, older than any fear, was unfolding. The shepherd's breath shortened, not from dread, but from being fully, wonderfully seen. The voice called him by the name that once echoed in a royal hall, and later whispered in a tent lit by little lamps. It spoke of ancestors who had camped beneath stars and of promises that never soured with age. It named chains and counted tears with numbers, only mercy keeps. Then came a command that sounded impossible, and yet perfectly sized for destiny. Go back. Lift the lowly. Speak to power, and watch what happens when heaven leans near. The shepherd trembled and told the truth about himself. Tongue slow, courage dented, past heavy. The answer was not scold, but presence. I will be with you. Signs flashed like lessons in trust. The staff became a serpent and back again. A hand turned sickly and then clean, as if the world itself could be rewritten. The voice offered a name like a horizon. Ever. Always here. And the mountain seemed to nod, having waited centuries for this yes. He poured out his hesitations like water from a cracked jar. Speech that tangled, history that accused, courage that limped. The voice did not withdraw. Instead, it braided provision through the gaps. A brother would meet him. Mouths would be paired so one heart could speak fluently. Staff would become sign. Ordinary wood would carry extraordinary weight. The shepherd bowed until forehead met dust that felt softer than any carpet, and a yes, quiet but real, settled in his chest. He rose different, carrying more than a stick and a plan. He carried a name that would outlast stone. The flock, unaware, pressed close as he began the descent, the burning at his back now inside him, steady and warm. At the tent, he asked for permission to return to the place of his birth. Blessing met him at the doorway, and farewell tasted like trust, the kind that lets a man walk toward the very thing he once fled. On the road back, the sky felt bigger and the wind more talkative. News reached him on travelers' tongues. The old throne had fallen to dust, but the new wore the same hard mask. He walked anyway, step by steady step, until the mountain's shoulders swung into view again, and a figure hurried up the trail, arms wide with laughter he had not heard in decades. Embrace cracked the shell time had built. Brother recognized brother. Stories spilled like grain from a split sack. The signs were shown and the mission spread between them like a map. Two voices, one message. Two staffs, one purpose. Evening wrapped them in violet and silver, and they spoke near a familiar ridge where fire once taught the ground to glow. The plan was simple in words, but vast in consequence. Go, gather the elders, speak the name, and watch a enslaved heartbeat quicken toward freedom. Morning found them moving. A family, a promise, and a pair of staffs that felt heavier with meaning than with wood. Hoofbeats and sandal scuffs marked a ribbon of path that threaded from desert quiet toward cities that grind and groan. The shepherd kept glancing at the sky, not for omens, but because it felt newly near, as if mercy were traveling with them like shade. Fear tried to whisper old stories. Faith answered with newer ones. Each pause became a small altar. Water shared, bread broken, reassurances spoken to hearts both young and weathered. Ahead lay questions sharper than spears, but also answers older than pyramids. He rehearsed words for elders and dreams for slaves, practicing courage in the space between breaths. As the road dipped toward the river he once left, the air tasted like memory and clean beginnings, and the fire that did not finish glowed inside his chest, steady and bright. Night gathered softly over the brickyards as whispers ran like quick birds. The brothers had returned with a name bright as morning. In a cramped courtyard, the elders assembled, faces carved by years and dust, but lit by hope they had not dared touch in a long time. The shepherd who wore the years like weathered bark lifted a staff that had learned obedience on lonely hills, and the signs unfolded, wood bending to life, skin made sick and then made well. Water from the river poured red assy, warning into a basin and not upon the ground. Words followed, not fancy but faithful. The God of your fathers has seen, has heard, has come down to bring you up. Knees found earth. Hands covered faces. Tears made small, dark circles in the dust as worship rose where groaning used to be. A hush settled afterward, not hollow but heavy with promise. Tomorrow would bring Pharaoh and hard walls, but tonight hope breathed, steady as a sleeping child. Morning broke against pillars painted with lotus and suns, and two shepherds stood before a throne that measured men by weight of gold. The request was simple and thunderous at once. Let my people go, that they may worship in the wilderness. Laughter cracked like lacquer. Courtiers smiled with lips, not eyes. A staff fell and became a serpent, quick as spilled shadow. Magicians answered with tricks that glittered but did not glow with truth. The serpent of the shepherd swallowed the rest, a quiet sermon in wood and scales. The throne's face hardened like sun-baked clay. Orders flew. Burdens grew. Straw was withheld so despair might multiply. Yet even as backs bent, a stubborn hope kept breathing. The brothers returned again and again with words that sounded like a river pushing at a dam. Let them go. Each refusal stacked like dark clouds on the horizon, promising that the sky itself would soon speak. The sky answered at last, not with one shout but with many. Rivers shamed into blood, frogs climbing into bowls of fine flour, dust awakening as gnats, then storms that split the horizon, darkness thick enough to touch. Each time the throne stiffened, each time the brothers spoke again. In the homes of those who listened, a different preparation stirred. A lamb chosen, a meal eaten in haste, sandals ready, staffs near the door. Blood marked lintels like a red string tied around a finger, so mercy would not forget the house within. Night held its breath while footsteps passed over. Inside, families told the oldest stories and added a new one, whispering hope into small ears that would one day remember. Before dawn, the city shook with grief. Permission burst forth not as kindness but as surrender to a purpose too strong to resist. And the people, not yet free, but suddenly called, moved toward the road they had longed to see. They left in a river of footsteps, arms full of dough that rose only in promise, not yet in ovens. Pillars of cloud and fire took turns at the front, like faithful guides who never slept. When the sea blocked the path and chariots carved dust behind, panic nipped ankles like wild dogs. The shepherd lifted hands in word, and Wayne shouldered the waters apart until the sea stood like two great windows, blue and shining with the secrets of the deep. Dry ground unrolled where waves had danced. Children stared wide-eyed at darting fish, caught in lanes of glass. They walked not fast, but sure. A people discovering that fear can be outrun by obedience. Behind them thundered iron and will, but a greater will held the walls like cupped hands. The last sandals reached the far shore, and the staff fell in a sweep that taught water to remember how to be a sea again. Morning poured gold across the far shore, and the sea lay smooth again as if no foot had ever asked it to change its mind. Silence ripened into singing. A woman lifted a tambourine, and the beat leapt like heart fire from palm to palm. The people answered with steps that forgot chains and throats that remembered joy. The shepherd stood a little apart, eyes wet, not for sorrow but for the fierce kindness that had followed him from a basket to a blaze, to a highway cut through a sea. He knew the road ahead would still learn the cadence of trust. One day, one need, one miracle at a time. But the truth was already carved in the morning. The God who draws out will keep on leading in cloud and flame until promises find their home. The song rose over water and wilderness alike, a banner for children yet to come. Freedom sings because love keeps its word.